Well, it's great to see you, Rachel. We do interact from time to time. We worked together when you were the envoy of the World Bank on climate, and I was the envoy of the UN. And then you moved during that time to head up the UN's sustainable energy. So you've been heading up a lot of things. What was for you the sort of the best moment of either pre or just after Paris? You know, the moment when you felt things might be moving in the right direction?
Oh, that's a great question, Mary, and it's lovely to see you. Yeah, we do go all the way back. I think I met you as a youth activist when you were the president of Ireland first off, and then our careers have intertwined ever since. I think for me, there were a number of moments. There were moments when it was like the clouds parted and you really saw what was at stake. And I remember traveling once, I think in the year before Paris, in the spring of 2014, just after Typhoon Haiyan had hit the Philippines, and visiting the devastation there as part of the World Bank Group's response, and then flying up to the Arctic to a meeting that had been convened by the Norwegians, and sitting in Svalbard and then points north at the research station there, listening to the ice sort of moaning, and really just understanding that we were all so deeply connected. And then I remember in the fall, just before we arrived in Paris, strenuous, frantic negotiations at the World Bank Group's annual meetings in Lima, trying to get a package together where the multilateral development banks were really going to be putting considerable amounts of money on the table, you know, to help achieve the 100 billion. You know, and here we are, nearly 2020, with the report that's just come out to say that we've still got 21 billion missing, but we are in the middle of an energy transition. So, you know, the sort of really, really, really hard fought diplomatic work on finance, but also these moments when you understood how we were all connected as humans. But that brings me to you, Mary. So you had all these incredible positions of leadership on human rights at the United Nations, following being the president of Ireland, and then setting up an extremely important foundation, which really changed the narrative, I think. I mean, you're the first person I heard talking about climate justice. And I remember once when you were the special envoy for the Great Lakes in Africa, and you talked about women in villages I think in the Eastern Congo, and their chance to be peace builders and peacemakers, but their need to have reliable, clean, affordable electricity. And you put everything together so beautifully. I mean, how did you first come across the way of framing climate as a justice issue?
Well, I came very late to the climate issue, to be honest. I mean, I served for my 5 years as UN High Commissioner, because I did an extra year from 1997 to 2002. There was another part of the UN dealing with the climate issue, and I was kind of in a silo. I didn't make the connection with human rights. It wasn't until I started working in African countries on economic and social rights. As an NGO, we had a little organization called Realizing Rights, which I'd founded, and we were trying to do what big organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch were doing on civil and political rights. They were holding governments to account. We were saying on economic and social rights, you got to work with governments on health, education, and then hold them to account. So it was really very interesting. But I kept hearing this, you know, refrain about things are so bad now. And the badness was that the changes were so unpredictable. As Constance O'Kellett, a grandmother like me, said, from a village in eastern Uganda, she said, "This is outside our experience. How are we to cope?" You know, and then she gradually learned about climate change and became a climate champion, firstly through Oxford and then Oxfam, and then Climate Wise Women. And it was these voices that to me were so important in helping to bring home the climate justice idea.
So now, we just had, I'm based in the United States now, I live in Massachusetts, as you noted, and we just had an election where the candidate who won, or who almost everybody believes won, fought on a platform of racial justice, climate justice, economic justice. How do you think we bring that into real meaning in people's lives? Because rhetorically, I think we've moved forward. I'm not sure we've achieved it yet.
Well, I think the idea of climate justice actually helps, because I often talk about the 5 layers of injustice that are behind climate justice. And the first layer is the fact that climate change has disproportionately and much earlier affected the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island states, the indigenous communities. And these, in fact, are the Black and brown and indigenous peoples of our world. So it's also a racial injustice. And then the second layer is the gender dimensions, the different social roles of women and men, particularly in the developing world, the lack of land rights, the lack of access to credit, and so on. And yet women have to be resilient and put food on the table and go further in drought for water, and so on. The third injustice is the intergenerational injustice that the children have reminded us of. The fourth injustice is a very subtle, but I think really important one, the injustice of the different pathways to development. Developing countries have found more coal, more oil, more gas. They have to take their people out of poverty. If they do, it will hurt them quickest because of the injustice of where they are in the world, but it will use up the carbon budget, and none of us will have a safe world or a future for our children and grandchildren. And then the fifth layer is the injustice to nature herself. And I was glad you mentioned that moment in the Arctic. I was in Greenland on a scientific expedition in August 2019, and I sat listening to a glacier calving, and I cried, because I felt the pressure nature was under. It literally moved me to tears, and that has never happened before. And it was an important experience. It was like an indigenous bit of wisdom coming into me, that so I really like the concept of just transition, which is essential to the whole idea of climate justice. And it has been thought about quite narrowly until this good report of the Institute for Human Rights and Business. I mean, I really like the way that there is a much broader sense in Helena Ward's report of the fact that there's a kind of just transition out of fossil fuel and a just transition into better jobs, etc. Recently, I took part in a discussion on another report, which is the People's Transition, Community-Led Development for Climate Justice. And that was even an extension of her thinking, and a very necessary one, because the EU is going to have a climate pact and is going to need communities. But above all else, we're going to need finance. And I think it would be good to hear you on, you've mentioned already that we're not there yet with the 100 billion, but we have seen investment in trillions wanting to move, even at the last COP, saying they want to move. Why is more not moving, and how do we get it to the local community level that will help the real just transition bottom up?
So I think that this is a great question, right? So at the front end of the transition, at the tip of the spear, things are going very fast, and financiers are talking about the warp speed at which money is moving from fossil fuels into renewables, and just on energy, but also the interest now in carbon-free multimodal transport systems and everything. And it feels like every day there's an announcement by a financier or a central bank or a finance ministry about how they're going to drive the transition forward. And then we've got this very long sort of shaft of the spear, and then we've got people who traditionally get left behind. I'm hoping that COVID, which has spiraled the world now into the broadest and deepest economic recession in sort of economic recorded history. More countries have gone to the IMF for help at the same time than ever before. The levels of indebtedness across middle income and low income countries are unprecedented and rising every day. That in this crisis, we can find our way into an opportunity to power forward that just transition. And I think two things are in our favor. It's just before COVID hit, the IMF, right, that sort of bastion of economic orthodoxy, had started to say, look, the most corrosive element of the way we are organized as a society at the moment is a lack of inclusion, so inequality. And they talked meaningfully about how inequality was eroding development and eroding growth and taking opportunities away for success from everybody. So they put inclusion right at the front of the agenda. And then they started to, they were under pressure, but also started to look at decarbonisation. Well, now the only way for us to come back from the situation we're in is to engineer a transition which helps countries decarbonise, but helps them build inclusive economies. And so that means that we have to solve for the debt crisis as well as decarbonisation, which means that, and we've found that very difficult to do politically for the last few months. With it, the world has not been able to organise itself with the kind of urgency needed. So hopefully with a change in politics in the United States, with a commitment from Europe, but now big commitments around decarbonisation from Eastern Europe, East Asia, sorry, maybe there's a chance for us to come around the table differently and start to talk about what that means. And that means doing something profound at scale. So that doesn't mean, just extending people's repayments by 3 months at the country level. It means, can we have a repurchasing of African debt by European nations in return for green investment in infrastructure and job-rich growth? Does it mean climate for debt swaps? Does it mean a new generation of sovereign performance bonds available to African? So this is going to be a Bretton Woods 2 moment. We have to lay the table differently so that we're having a different conversation, a different idea of what success looks like. This isn't about austerity and the 1% getting richer. And also different people sitting at the table. India and China will have to be there. They're the creditors now, along with the West. What would happen if nature had a seat at the table? Would it be different? What if Indigenous people were at the table? What if there were more women at the table? So this is our moment to try to engineer that. Are we good enough to seize it? That's really the question.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. It hasn't been a great time in multilateralism. The elders that I chair have been very concerned that the space has somehow been shrinking for a collaborative multilateralism, which was there for the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. Hopefully now, with the Biden-Harris administration coming in, we will see a resurgence. But just to get back to the climate financing part of it, I mean, do we need, you were involved in the IFC performance standards, but how can we create more leverage and make ESG more concerned about the S in ESG?
So I think there's a really interesting debate at the moment about the fact that we need more E than just carbon. So we need water, forests, etc., and we need to be better at that. And then a discussion around the S and the G, and I work a little bit on issues around food as well as energy and finance. And, there it's a question of, a major food conglomerate has to report on its water use and things like that. It doesn't really have to report on whether it's producing products that are killing people and killing the planet. And so there's a sort of much more multi-stakeholder approach needed to what that ES and G looks like. But over and above the ESG, which is sort of it's sort of underneath the hood of the car, the question is really, what kind of car are we driving? And so when it comes to the public climate finance, the debate that, and I was very much part of this, right, when I was at the bank and IFC, was, how much of the multilateral finance and how much of the ODA, the bilateral development finance, is going to support climate positive things, and how do we use that public money to leverage private money, right, and private investment in. I don't think that that's the conversation, but the conversation shouldn't be, how much of the multilateral development bank's money can get coded as climate finance, either adaptation or mitigation. The question now before the multilateral development banks is, everything that they do must be about the transition. They should not be doing anything outside of the boundaries of the transition. Now, transition has to be just, and the transition has to be where a country is and where it can go to, so reflecting what its energy endowment is, etc. But it isn't a question of business as usual and then how much of that can be climate sensitive. The question is, it's not business as usual. And that, I think, is a real challenge, because there's an enormous technical capacity in these multilateral instruments and in bilateral aid agencies. but we can't have a situation where left hand and right hand are not sort of in a tight just transition handshake. And I think that's really a big question. And that's where I think local stakeholder pressure, community-led, communities can understand what their resilience might look like. Do you get your inspiration still from the local organizing?
Very much so. I mean, I wrote a book on climate justice, hope, resilience, and the fight for a sustainable future. 11 stories, 9 of them involved women working locally, but also 2 good men. And basically, it was all about, community resilience building, which is so important. If we can have people have a sense that actually climate action is good for them, they don't have that sense at the moment. So governments have a task. They've got to move forward rapidly, even though they don't have broad consent yet, because people haven't seen that it's good for them. So the sooner we can get it across that this has to be fair, it has to have regard to those most vulnerable, those most likely to be affected, and those who are in a transition out of their jobs, they really have to feel part of the way forward too, with their communities. And I think, that's why I think the idea of a people's transition is one that I like a lot, because it embraces the whole, and it's showing the top-down levers that can help a lot, but also the bottom-up sense. This is actually going to be better for me and my family, and we need to get that across. We need, Article 6 on broader education. The sort of and this needs a kind of intelligent financing. So I hope that the European Global Compact that they're talking about, the next stage in the Green Deal, will really be a bottom-up resourced. We'll understand that we have to bring people with us. We cannot have gilets jaunes movements or
Right.
resistance because it seemed to be unfair. And these movements can be terribly destructive if they get going. So instead, we actually need this sense of a people-owned transition movement, which is the way forward now to a more sustainable, nature-based future.
You've always been very clear about the solidarity needed between people, and I think that if you're the unemployed steelworker in Scunthorpe or the solar home system installer in Sierra Leone, you actually have much more in common than our politicians sometimes will imply. And anything that I think brings it reintroduces the idea of solidarity and that there are win-win-wins here, right? This is not a story of sacrifice. It's a story of a change and a shift, especially for those whose carbon footprint has been way outside the boundaries of what is just. But everybody can survive. Huh?
And I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen, the impact of having a frontline human rights person at a COP. Listening to Hindu Omara Ibrahim, or listening to Constance O'Cullett from Uganda, stand up and say, this is what it's like. This is what it means. This is what we're trying to do. And exactly. it kind of has a huge impact on the technical pen pushers who tend to be the delegates who, are only thinking about guarding their paragraph or whatever it might be, and having the reality, the shining a light on what frontline defenders are doing, and many of them are indigenous peoples who have huge indigenous wisdom. I've actually been lucky. I have a podcast, Mothers of Invention, which I think you possibly know
it's
of.
Great.
Do you?
Yes, love it.
And what we've tried to do, particularly in this series, is to listen to voices of women of the South in the United States, women of the South globally, and indigenous peoples, and the guardians of the seeds, the protectors of the forest. Their sense of 7 generations as being the short term, we have so much to learn.
You always used to push me very hard when I was the special representative on sustainable energy, about the last mile. And we started just the thoughts experiment. It was more than an experiment in the end, which is that if we treat the last mile as the first mile, then everybody else will get taken care of. And I think that is a very important part of what we're up to now.
The elders have also been very involved in intergenerational conversations, blogs by young climate activists, etc. Shia Bastida is one of my heroines. She's an 18-year-old from Mexico studying now in the United States, and she's so articulate exactly on what you say. And they've learned, from the way that COVID has exacerbated all of these inequalities, how they are linked, the intersectionality between them. And I think this is important even for the movements around the world, that they must coalesce now in a transition that has to be a people's transition to really achieve in a very short time, that frightens a lot of scientists, that we actually make that just transition, and that it is truly just and fair, both for future generations, but also for the current inequalities that have to be addressed importantly. And then we can smile and think this will be a better future.